What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. I'm Colin Newby of 97.5 The Fanatic and 93.3 WMMR, coming to you weekly with Philly Sports Talk.
This is the ultimate team game. You can't be great without the greatness of others.
It's finally time to wrap up the Super Bowl festivities, and I thought what better way than the quote that I considered the summary of the season, the real message of what the Eagles accomplished. That line, you can't be great without the greatness of others, hasn't really caught the traction that I thought it was going to, but I'll tell you one thing, it was a little bit better than the messages the players sent on the steps of the art museum. Not really safe for this show, actually. It was funny, we were at Pagano's on Market Street, broadcasting with the Fanatic. It was the best show ever at that point. They were talking about how the crowd was drinking too much and how all the Valentine's Day reservations at night were canceled because people weren't making it. I don't know if they considered that the players were probably on the sauce a little bit also, and with all the F-bombs being dropped, kept having to cut away, and broadcasting the live speeches never really panned out. I don't think it panned out the way we thought it would, at least. But it was a great day overall leading up to that, and that broadcast altogether, just that little part didn't work out. It was a great day at Pagano's too, but the bigger festivities took place at the Cambria on Broad Street. That's the hotel between Walnut and Locust. We had two broadcasts there, one for MMR, the Preston and Steve show on one side, and later Pierre Robert also, and the 97.5 The Fanatic shows right on the other side, and that was just absolutely incredible to be set up in that location right in the heart of the action on Broad Street. It's why people get into the business, and it was just one of the most fun work days I've ever had. That crowd was absolutely wild from the second I walked down there. The balcony level was just perfect to see the whole city and experience the vibe. I walked out the front door of the hotel at a couple points, and at a certain point in the day, that was no longer worth it, just because you could barely move on the sidewalk. But to have that balcony level and to see all the buses go by, that's really what it's all about. And then throughout the day, you just had a lot of festivities up on that balcony. Casey Boy from Preston and Steve was shooting out T-shirts. We had Tyrone Johnson out there, too, of the Fanatic. He was throwing out beads, the green-colored beads for the Eagles. Casey throwing out the Preston and Steve Kelly green T-shirts. Just a memorable experience altogether. And then later in the day, when we did end up getting to Pagano's on Market with the Fanatic broadcast equipment and all, when Tyrone and Ricky Bowe were on, I noticed the same thing that I remember thinking 7 years ago at the last Super Bowl parade after Super Bowl 52. I was at Devil's Alley after the parade cleared out, and to get to Devil's Alley, even to get inside, was an absolute mess. And every bar that is that crowded that I've ever been into is a terrible vibe. And I'm upstairs, you're like, no elbow room, can't even lift up to shove through people. And somehow, some way, everybody was just so nice to each other. Pagano's wasn't as crowded to where you couldn't move, but it was the same way. It was a huge drinking crowd, and like the rowdiest people, Eagles fans, these people with a terrible reputation. Everybody was just so nice to each other. Who in the world was in a bad mood? Oh, just how Philadelphia shows out for these things really blows my mind. I talked about the celebrations after the Super Bowl, how I don't really understand how ripping out a traffic light is a celebration, but all in all, the Philadelphia fans are the most passionate, the most passionate in professional sports altogether, I believe. And then the highest level of passion in this town in particular is for the Eagles. Actually, just heard a really funny story in the aftermath. I did not know people were doing this. Well, I didn't know this was the root of how drunk people were. I certainly saw some drunk people, and early enough in the day to where you're like, wow, what are they doing? But people were sleeping on Thursday afternoon, waking up and going out on Thursday night, staying in city bars until 2 a.m. when you get kicked out, and then at 2 a.m., just walking out onto the streets and getting their spot for the parade, staying there that long, and I'm sure drinking the entire time. And that's a buddy from Beasley Media, Mike Cherico, is a producer, but he also works at Brew in Center City, the bar right outside of McGillen's. And he's telling me these stories of, I guess, probably young 20s groups trying to do that, and just people stumbling early on Friday morning, 7, 8 a.m. when the bar staffs are getting in. They're seeing people that got kicked out from the night before at 2 a.m. when the doors close, and they are still on the streets right outside those bars. So if there's one story that you think represents how that crowd was behaving on Friday, I think that one might be it. But this is closing the book on one of the best seasons in Philadelphia sports history, a season I'll remember forever, a playoff run especially that I'll remember forever, and the listening audience knows that from all the event recaps that I've been doing, and just a blast to be in the media industry myself for sports radio to experience this ride. It's just been such a pleasure, and I think the overall outlook, the season to be remembered, and so many narratives that'll come up just to go down in Philadelphia sports history. I think mainly for Nick Sirianni and Jalen Hurts, silencing the critics was a big deal for the greater majority of the fan base to get behind the idea of their guys overcoming all the haters. But the way I see it, at least, it was more about that idea of such a complete roster rolling on all cylinders and taking pressure off each other. That's something I've talked about in the past couple of episodes, how the Eagles were so complete at every position, and especially how well that defense in the first year under Vic Fangio came together and blew all expectations out of the water. And in the larger picture, I think all of these ideas are tied to how well the Eagles as a franchise have solidified themselves along the offensive and defensive lines. I think that's the real root of it over a longer period of time. And then this season, I think the defense was kind of the last leg to come together in that Vic Fangio system that I've gushed about so much, especially in recent episodes. When we come back, I'm going to jump into something I wasn't sure if I would want to discuss in February with such an obvious high-profile storyline like an Eagles Super Bowl to rant on and on about. But hockey fights have a way of attracting my attention. We'll get to the NHL Four Nations face-off on the other side of the break.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Colin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
You have to have heard by now because the NHL Four Nations face-off has completely stolen the attention of the sports world. Remarkably, 3 fights in 9 seconds for Team USA Canada up in Montreal on Saturday night. The 2 Kachuk brothers on USA, predictably, Matthew fought Brandon Hagel right off the opening draw, and then right after that, Brady fought Sam Bennett. 9 seconds into the game, you get Colton Parayko versus JT Miller at the other end of the ice. They all got 5 for fighting, and then JT Miller got an extra 2 minutes. I think the refs might have, at that point, been like, okay, we started enough fights, got to hand out the 2-minute instigator to actually move on with the game and have some sort of additional consequence. But you had Colton Parayko there, who's 6'6". JT Miller's only 6'1". A little bit less of a weight disparity, but I still considered it a mismatch. And the Kachuk brothers being the ones in these fights, I don't think anybody's surprised about that. But Hagel and Bennett, the two Canadians who fought, not the biggest fighters in the NHL, but these are guys that can throw. So I think that just set this incredible tone and lit the crowd up in Montreal on fire. And it just really came together with all the elements that you needed for this international best-on-best to work. Part of it, what I was worried about, though, was with staged fights, it might have been a little bit forced. So I was fired up to see the beginning of that game, yes, but that's still a question I had, and within a couple minutes, that was gone. There was a ton of intensity from start to finish. I remember Charlie McAvoy hitting Connor McDavid along the boards, and that was just absolutely outstanding altogether. And then on top of the fights, you've got the dream matchups that people have been talking about really in hypotheticals since that World Cup of Hockey back in 2016. You've got McDavid and McKinnon for Canada and Matthews and Eichel on Team USA. Those are some of the top groups of centers in the entire NHL, and they're finally getting to do this. And what I said a couple months ago when the rosters were first announced, that this was such an integral part of the history of the game of hockey, that these guys, this top group of superstar centers, they needed to face off against each other, especially as USA is probably as high as they've ever been in the pecking order, arguably deeper and more talented than Team Canada. If you said that even 10 years ago, it probably would have sounded ridiculous because the Canadians were coming off those 2 gold medals in 2010 and 14, and they were just a little bit above the USA, who kind of felt like the little brothers of these international tournaments. At least those 2 Olympics, they were just one step behind Canada. Doesn't really seem like they even have Finland and Sweden in this tournament, which I kind of thought of it as a flaw entering. It was a slight criticism that I had early in the tournament. I think it's called a round robin, but whatever we're referring to it as, ESPN even called it the main event. USA-Canada they referred to as the main event. So I think when they staged this tournament, that's really what they had in mind. Finland and Sweden got thrown in a little bit. Russia's not even in it. They probably do have enough talent to ultimately win it. The Czechs, I know I had heard the Czech players were very upset that they weren't involved because at least there was a reason that Russia didn't get the call. And then there's a lot of other nations across the world that have had great hockey development programs that are just light years ahead of where they were at the last Olympics or some of these international best on best. So is that a great element of this whole event? No, it's not, but God, I can't complain about anything after that Team USA Canada game on Saturday night. They're now matching up in the finals. That became official on Monday. They had the 2 games on President's Day to determine that last spot. Team USA already had their spot clinched, but Canada beat Finland in regulation to get the second place finish in the first. I guess that's the round robin stage. But anyway, both teams have advanced to the championship, and that's Thursday night at TD Garden in Boston. I think the Saturday night game broke all kinds of viewership records, and I expect the championship game to do the same. While the NHL has all this momentum, the sports world is talking about other All-Star games and how the NHL did it so well to exceed the output of those games, because the Pro Bowl was recently, if they even still call it the Pro Bowl, whatever flag football thing they've thrown in there. And then NBA All-Star Weekend was concurrent to this, and not a lot of people paid attention to that. Meanwhile, you have the highest level of intensity on the NHL side, but part of the problem that these events have, the reason that they are so boring, is because they don't want players to get injured. The Pro Bowl, they're not even hitting anymore to avoid injuries. NBA players don't really go hard. They certainly don't play defense in a lot of these games, really because they don't want to tire themselves out. It's about the marketing, the star power, more than it is the effort on the court, on the field, whatever. And when NHL players are giving this kind of effort on the ice, Shea Theodore hurt in the first game, out for the tournament. Cal McCarr missed some time. He's going to be back in for the championship, but he was injured enough to sit out. Charlie McAvoy, he's going to miss the championship. Alex Pietrangelo and Quinn Hughes didn't even participate. From a Flyers point of view, Rasmus Ristolainen didn't participate for Sweden either. Brady and Matthew Tkachuk are looking like they'll play for the championship game, but still I worry that it's not sustainable for the NHL to do this kind of thing. I realize it's not an annual tradition, but the whole reason that All-Star games are boring is because you can't risk injury. The NHL clearly is risking injury by setting this international stage. But even if injuries do kind of kill the momentum here, I don't know if they can cancel international best on best again like they did for the 2018 Olympics. I know they planned to go to the 2022 Olympics, but it didn't work out because of COVID. But in reading this piece that everyone's talking about from NHL.com, some of these guys like Brad Marchand and Victor Hedman, they were two of the big names quoted in the story. They're talking about how international best on best is the highest level of competition in the game of hockey. At that point, can Gary Bettman and the NHL really rob these players of this tradition? I mean, it just went away for 9 years since the World Cup of Hockey, and now it's back, and now there's such a spark around all of this. I don't know if they can cancel it because of injuries, and I think they've caught the essence of what this is all about and how important it is to the players. I don't know if they can rob that, even if they are costing NHL franchises games. And we'll see how long-term some of those injuries I just mentioned will be. But I remember in past competitions, like the 2014 Olympics, John Tavares, he was still with the Islanders at that point, but he suffered a long-term injury. Dominik Hasek in the 2006 Olympics, he got injured. So it's not like this is a new thing. I just hope that it doesn't ruin the entire experience, because this is just absolutely outstanding for the game of hockey, a sport that I've criticized in the past for hurting themselves, not being able to do these high-profile things and taking the advantages that it has over other sports and hiding them as some kind of weird niche instead of profiting off them like this tournament finally seems to be doing. Before I wrap up, just wanted to touch quickly on the Flyers who are participating. It hasn't been much of the center of attention, but Travis Sanheim played on Saturday in the USA-Canada game. He had 15 minutes and 14 seconds of ice time. He did end up with an assist against Sweden in the third game, or against Finland, in the third game of the tournament when Canada clinched their spot. But I wouldn't say he's played the most major role. He sat out the first game, and then Konechny actually sat out the game against Team USA. he's going to be back in the lineup for the championship, but those two haven't played the biggest roles on Team Canada. Everybody who's participating, I'm sure, has a ton of passion, but they haven't been as much of the center of attention. Surprisingly, Sam Ersson ended up with the guy with maybe the biggest contributions of the Flyers of the entire tournament. He saved 32 out of 33 against Team USA in Sweden's third game of the tournament. He stepped in for Linus Ullmark in what was ultimately kind of like a consolation game. But with that passion that I'm talking about, this pride in representing your country, I think there was still a little more intensity in that USA-Sweden game when the spots were already finalized than there would be in a normal exhibition game. But Ersson was great against USA. Get 32 out of 33 saves. Sweden ends up winning that game 2-1. And then, of course, the Flyers are also represented by John Tortorella. He's an assistant on the Team USA staff. Mike Sullivan is the head coach, Sullivan of the Pittsburgh Penguins. But I'm happy that Tortorella spoke so boldly when the Four Nations rosters were announced. He talked about how important the tournament is to NHL players, and what I was just mentioning about how sometimes it is a direct disadvantage to their NHL team having 2 weeks of these high-intensity games. It's like when you hear about so many NHL players injured in the Stanley Cup playoffs and playing through it, and then they have to have off-season surgery. Well, it's the same idea here. You're in high-stakes competition. You're playing through the pain. They've been very physical games, as we saw on Saturday night. But Tortorella kind of waived that complaint. He said, no, this is very important to the players, and it needs to be taken seriously, not like some all-star games. And sometimes these things are just taken as seriously as a coach is going to speak about it. And for John Tortorella to step up, push back on that idea of it being a disadvantage to an NHL team, good for him. And I think the tone of that, and not just from Tortorella, but from everybody speaking about it and from that one instance that I'm referring to, I think that's helped this tournament become, at least the center stage of the sports world for another couple days. So Thursday night, Team USA Canada. I'll discuss that championship matchup next week. And I also hope to switch gears to Philly spring training and get some guests out there too. That'll put a wrap on it for this week. Thanks for joining me, Philadelphia. This has been First Time, Long Time.